Hey, how we doing, everybody? Yeah, are you guys all psyched to be here? I can tell you I'm super hyped to be here after going to a couple of these Shelling Point events earlier this year. I really just think that they're the best events in Web3, and I mean, what great topics, right? Funding experiments and positive visions of the future. So yeah, can we get a round of applause for all that, or just? Yeah, thank you. Awesome. Sweet. Well, so as Evan said, I'm Andrew. I'm here with Radicle, and I've actually been working with them since 2018, but been working on drips for the last year and Radicle funding, and I'm excited to share a little bit about some of the funding experiments that we've been working on with that. So yeah, let's just jump right into it. First, I want to just kind of introduce a few things for folks who might not be familiar with Radicle and a few of the concepts that we'll be talking about. So what is Radicle? Radicle is a Web3 community with kind of two main missions. The first one is to develop sovereign infrastructure for code collaboration. And that's kind of a mouthful, so the easiest way that I usually explain that is just as a decentralized GitHub. GitHub is great. I think a lot of amazing open source projects are building on GitHub, and probably a lot of the projects you guys are working on are building on GitHub. But a lot of people, I mean, GitHub has certain problems, right? We're building all this open, free, decentralized software on top of a system that's ultimately a closed, centralized system owned by, everyone's favorite tech giant. So we're trying to build some alternative to that, built on Git and open protocols and free open tooling. So that's kind of the first part of the mission. And the second part is the part that I'm going to be talking a bit more about here today. And it's really to do with creating funding solutions that allow FOSS developers to thrive financially while releasing their work in the open. And we want to emphasize the thrive part, because I think too often there's kind of this idea of folks working in open source, like celebrating them being able to survive. It's like, oh, you were able to make enough money to like pay rent. And that is better than not being able to pay rent, but we really feel that open source and FOSS generally is just such an important public good and makes such a big contribution to our society and particularly to the future that folks who contribute to successful FOSS projects to really make enough funding to be able to thrive as kind of an alternative to working for like big Web 2 companies or like DeFi projects or something. So quickly, for those who don't know, what is FOSS? This is just, if you want, you could just think of this as almost like open source software. But it's a more general term that also includes free software. Free here refers to liberty, not to price. So it's really kind of the union of software from the free software movement and the open source software movement. But just like to define that term, since often people haven't heard it. As I hinted at a minute ago, the reason that we're so excited about FOSS is that there's some small disagreements about this, but I think generally most economists and most people that have looked at FOSS feel like FOSS is a public good, and it's, I think, one of the most interesting public goods when you look at how much the power of technology is kind of gaining control over our lives. Evan talked a bit about this a few minutes ago, but this idea of software eating the world. Well, if software is going to eat the world, then it seems pretty important that as much of that software as possible can be open and free. So we really feel that this is an incredibly important public good for all of us to be thinking about how to fund and incentivize versus, again, like the closed proprietary versions, that I think we're all concerned about. I have a little definition of public goods there, but I think probably a lot of people here are familiar, so I'm just going to kind of keep moving to try to get to some of the more fun, exciting stuff. But there's this problem, right? So I alluded to this earlier as well, but many FOSS devs are still underfunded. So I'm just going to read this quote from Nadia Eghbal, who's an incredible, maybe some of you have read her work. She's an incredible journalist and researcher in this space. And I think she's just done some of the absolutely best writing and thinking around funding for FOSS. So she writes, many open source projects are experiencing a difficult transition from selfless creative pursuit to critical public infrastructure. Today, infrastructure work is being cobbled together by freelance developers or those with day jobs doing unrelated paid client work for part of the month and working on open source projects in their spare time. While this is a viable way to pay for one's lifestyle, it does not adequately reflect the social value that these projects deserve. So again, I suspect that like a lot of you guys in the audience are probably pretty sympathetic. And just out of curiosity, like little show of hands, who out there has contributed to a FOSS project of some kind? Yeah, nice, awesome, almost everybody. And who's, how many of you have contributed to a FOSS project unpaid or like minimally paid? Okay, cool, yeah, like a lot of people as well. So I guess I probably don't need to spend too much time on this slide, but you know, it's great that people, again, can kind of like scrape by and you know, work a different job and be able to contribute to FOSS, but wouldn't it be a better world if people could like, more people could focus their full energy on building this important public good that's essentially going to define a lot of the future. So this is really the mission of Radicle funding, or this second mission of Radicle. We're working to deliver Web3 native funding solutions that will allow FOSS developers to thrive financially while releasing their work in the open. And I'm gonna jump into a little bit of kind of like what those experiments look like and how we're doing this, and you know, maybe some of the tools that you can even incorporate into your projects to you know, collaborate with what we're doing and get involved. So a lot of this for the last year we've been doing kind of under the banner or brand of the DRIPS protocol. And so what the DRIPS protocol is when we sort of set out on thinking about how would you get funding to FOSS developers, we started thinking about like, okay, like what is the toolkit that you would need? And you know, one thing that Nadia has written a lot about, and others who have, you know, talked to people in the FOSS community, is a lot of people from open source are actually pretty uneasy with the idea of money in open source, and I think that's a fair concern. And particularly sort of like large amounts of money, kind of cash grab type things. So you know, particularly some of the crypto things from 2017. I think a lot of people from the open source world are understandably and reasonably concerned with, you know, bringing this kind of element into the world of FOSS. And so one of the mechanisms that we wanted to add right away was something much more like a Patreon style model of support, where it would be like small recurring payments, where there would be much more accountability. So versus like just massive amounts of money sort of thrown at developers or projects. And so, you know, nothing. You know, we looked around the space, and there was Sabler.finance had done some kind of things around streaming and Superfluid, but there was nothing that really had the kind of like design. The design elements that we were looking for. And so the first thing we did was build an Ethereum protocol that allows what you could think of as recurring payments, but in Web3 they're really streaming payments. So these are essentially like monthly continuous payments from one Ethereum user to another. We felt like that was like a fundamental building block for building a Patreon style model of support or a crowdsourced model of support. So that's the first thing that DRIPS does. Any user can create a DRIP, which is a recurring continuous stream of funds from their account to any other user or smart contract. And then the second kind of primitive that we felt like was really necessary was something for sharing, or what we call splitting. And this was something, again, that, you know, Mirror had been playing around with. They have a concept of splits. There's zero splits actually came out kind of around the same time that we introduced drip splits. But drips also includes a primitive for splitting. So this is a way to share a percentage of any funds dripped to a user with anyone they wish. And I think one of the easiest ways to kind of like understand the power of this is when you look at some of these things that have happened in the sort of traditional financial world, like you know, 10% for the planet or 1% for the planet, these kind of things where people will commit to donate a percentage of any revenue or profit coming to them to third parties that they believe in or that they depend on. And we felt like this was a really important piece. So you know, we're going on to build Radicle Funding, which is a set of experiments and experiences on top of DRIPS. But we've also just put DRIPS out there as essentially public funding infrastructure that we hope more and more projects will build on. We're talking to a bunch of projects. We're talking to Giveth, talking about integrating with Grants Hub, and a number of DeSci projects. So, but please, you know, if you're interested in building on DRIPS, come find me or come find us on Discord. We'd love to connect with more projects looking to build on this infrastructure. So, you know, very quickly, it's a free public open protocol. that any dApp or smart contract can build on. We have a JavaScript SDK, so you can build it into your web apps. And Drips version 1 is live on Ethereum mainnet. Drips v2 is in test on Goerli, and it's coming to mainnet very soon. And Drips v2 includes all sorts of new powerful features, like streaming any ERC20, scheduling. You can schedule Drips in the future or have them end, and also unlimited NFT-based sub-accounts. So those were kind of the building blocks, but this is like it sort of gets more exciting. Now we're starting to run experiments, and we've been running some funding experiments for can we really make this work? And the first funding experiment that we ran and that we will be building into the other part of Radicle is this idea of kind of like a fund me button. So the big vision here is to give any developer or open source project the option to turn on a fund me button on their project profile page, where anyone who wants to support them can just immediately fund them through cryptocurrency, any ERC20 token, across borders, really from anywhere. So they could be anyone, and they can do it anonymously if they want to. Just kind of like blow the doors off funding for any open source dev if they want to do that. And so we actually ran a first version of this experiment on the drips.network website. You can go check it out. There's a number of communities raising funds there. But this screen actually kind of shows, so this shows the Radicle.xyz app, which is actually, so this project RX is a open source pixel editor written in Rust that is building on the Radicle code collaboration stack. And right now there is no fund me button there today, but we'll be adding this. So essentially any project building on the Radicle code collab tooling will have the option to just flip a switch and turn on a fund me button so that anyone can fund their project. We also are going to continue to build out the drips.network, the Drips web app, so that any project, even if you're just like still on GitHub or GitLab, or even you're doing like a proprietary closed code collab environment, you can still just create a public profile page for your project and raise funds crypto natively with essentially no barriers or upfront things to set up, no bank account needed, and no documents. So and then this kind of shows what that would look like. You would the supporter would click fund me, and then they would be able to configure a drip going to the developers of RX, and they could set any amount of DAI that they want to stream per month, or actually any other ERC20 token. And boom, they'd be supporting them in kind of a Patreon style setup. So that's really the first experiment we've been running, like I said, we're excited to kind of weave it into the rest of the Radicle experience. The second part, or the second experiment that we've been running over the last year, is this notion of splitting that I was talking about earlier. And we also think this is really important. I think one observation is that a lot of the most prominent open source projects have a lot of funding now. Google is funding a lot of Linux distributions, and you have, particularly in crypto, right? You have these big crypto projects that have open source software that are incredibly well funded, but then often, there's something like 25 million open source projects, or probably more now, on GitHub. So down, once you get into kind of low-level libraries, a lot of times they're not as well funded. Nadia Egbal has this great example from her paper about I think it's OpenSSL, but it's one of the projects in the SSL kind of ecosystem, and how this is a few years ago, but it was sort of like the whole internet was running on SSL for its security, and it was maintained by like a single developer who had gotten very sick and had no funding at all, and it's kind of crazy how much of this infrastructure is crumbling and unsupported down low. So we see splits as a real way to try to address that, where projects can contribute to their dependencies. And so this screen that's shown here is actually from the Drips v1 app at drips.network. You can go see this if you want to today. And when we created the first version of Drips, we reached out to a number of teams in Web3. One of them was the Solidity language team, the team that develops the Solidity language. Probably a lot of you have used it. And we asked them, hey, participate in this kind of funding game. And What was really interesting was they said, we actually are pretty well funded. We're close enough to a lot of successful projects that we don't have a problem with funding. So we don't need to actually receive direct funding ourselves, but we would love to kind of participate in this, and we depend on a number of projects that are not well funded. So we would love to kind of play the splits game, and they actually set up this splits configuration with about 10 different projects and folks that they depend on, and they're splitting actually 100% of their funds to those dependencies. And so I don't know what the current total is, but you can go and see. I think some thousands of dollars have been streamed through this contract to those supporters. And we thought this was like a really neat kind of validation for this idea, but also pretty amazing to see that a team like Solidity would actually share 100% of the funds donated to them. So yeah, we see just a lot of potential. And coming up in the next version of this in Drips v2 and Radicle funding, we're going to be building tools to kind of help people automate this process of figuring out who their dependencies are. I think one of the cool things about FOSS is that if you work with like a package manager like NPM, you can pretty easily see all the different projects that you depend on, and maybe get some hints at who could use support as well. So trying to pull some of this together and connect it to some of the kind of themes for this event made me think about a novel that I read back in the 90s. Maybe some of you have read it. It's called The Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson, and it's a pretty incredible kind of like look at the future, which now is not that different than the future that we're living in so many ways, both technologically but also economically. And the kind of, I guess, spoiler alert, the sort of short version of the story is that there's massive wealth inequality, but access to ubiquitous free educational technology ends up kind of leveling the playing field, and a lot of people gain access to the ability to program and to technology ultimately, and it kind of turns the tables on this control that the oligarchy had over the world. And so in today's world, we kind of have that free technology. I mean, anyone can get online and take MIT CS classes essentially for free. I mean, there's incredible resources to learn to code. I mean, I think about comparing it to when I learned to code, and yet, so we kind of have that part of it. But I think opportunities in tech are still very limited for many communities, as we've all seen. So why is this? Well, there's lots of reasons that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. It can be hard to get your first job or gig without experience. I think we all have probably experienced reading some of these job postings where it's looking for like 10 years of experience in something that's only existed for 3 years. But then for people really on the margins, I mean, there's 2 billion people that are still unbanked. There are major regulatory challenges around standard employment models. Even if I wanted to support someone as an employee, in India or really any other country, doing that is not straightforward. I would have to set up a very specialized type of corporation, deal with lawyers. I can't just pay someone what might be a life-changing amount of money for them and a relatively small amount of money for me, to do important public goods work. But the question I want to ask is, I guess, could Web3 native crowd-funded FOSS offer a way for devs from underprivileged communities to finally break into tech and get paid well for contributing to building important public goods? I think many of these mechanisms and solutions we're building kind of get around some of these challenges. One neat thing that I've been thinking a lot about is that the donation model sort of skips a lot of the traditional these kind of employment constraints that I just mentioned. Like, if I want to employ someone to do something, there's just a million hurdles and regulatory risks. But if I want to just give someone $10 or $100, that's something that you can go out into the streets of Bogota and do today, right? There's no constraints around that, or there's much, much less. And so I think that just kind of turning the tables on that, if you could imagine large amounts of funds flowing into some of these open source projects, and then them getting contributors who, could be a kid living on the streets in India, it could be a kid living on the streets in Detroit, it could be, it could be anyone in the world. I guess I have this vision that maybe some of these things could be put together to try to really open up access to these incredible opportunities for a lot more people. So now, let's see, how many minutes do we have left? Do we have any minutes left? Awesome. Okay, so yeah, we have about 5 or 6 minutes left, and I really wanted to try to kind of make it a bit more interactive. I mean, first off, I would love to just continue this discussion with all of you, and I'd love to have you all connect with our team as well, after this 5 minutes is over. But even just now here, I'd love to kind of pose all these questions to people here in the crowd, and let's have a little discussion. Feel free to just take any of these questions in any order. How can we use these tools and others to extend opportunities to marginalized and underprivileged communities, to be paid well, contributing to FOSS? What next steps would you like to see us take, the Web3 community take, to try to make this reality? What are the next experiments we should run, kind of in the spirit of what we've been doing? And what issues or roadblocks do you see? So I guess, raise your hand if you have, and I think someone will. Oh, great, thanks.
Great talk. So similar to Patreon, where a big reason people continue to contribute is getting a narrative back from the artist or creator that they're supporting. I'm wondering how you're thinking about the people that are receiving these drips, informing the people who are giving the drips what work they've been doing so that they can feel like they're part of that narrative and have confidence that their money is going to FOSS as opposed to something else.
Yeah, fantastic question. So we're doing a few different things there, and I'm really glad you mentioned that. So in Drips V1, the first thing we did was try to give certain types of access that you often get. So I guess broadly we think about this as in two parts. One is trust anchoring, which is like, first of all, just making sure that your supporters are giving funds to like the right person, because we don't want like sort of people coming in and pretending to be someone else and getting funding. So for that, we're actually working with the the Gitcoin Passport team right now to create like hopefully fully trustless, or not entirely trustless, but very trustworthy actors to create verifiable credentials of other types of identity, like Twitter handles or GitHub accounts, or essentially anything that you have OAuth for. You'll be able to attest that you're like the right person. So that's kind of the first thing, is like, can you trust that this person you're donating to is actually who they say they are? And then the second part is kind of, I think, more what your question was about, which is what we think of as broadly as benefits. So like, what can the developer kind of give back to the folks who are supporting them? Even if it's just like badges of support, or and this is something we played a bit with in Drips V1. In Drips V1, like I said, we had this idea of NFT badges of support. So if you were a supporter, you would actually get an NFT associated with your membership that would kind of show like, hey, I'm a supporter of this particular developer. We also played with the idea of like gated access to private Discord channels, where maybe they would give like support, and a number of other things. We're actually going out right now and interacting with, so we have someone from our team going out and connecting with a bunch of FOSS projects who are looking for funding to try to actually drill down on this a bit more and see, because I think there's so many different types of benefits you could offer, and I think the ones that are common with like Patreon probably may not be as applicable to this. So we want to do some kind of like user research, and for the next version really drill down on what is going to have the biggest impact. But those are kind of some of the ideas that we're playing with. So in fact, that's actually another good kind of call. If anyone here in the audience knows a FOSS project that's like looking for funding, or if you're like a developer for such a project, please come and connect with us. We're like actively looking to connect with projects to try to get set up on the platform and help give us ideas about what sorts of benefits would make the most sense for you and your supporters. Sweet. All right. Let's see. I see someone back there.
Hey, great presentation. I was curious, so I know that one sentiment in the FOSS community is around many contributors already being intrinsically motivated, and the hardest work in these projects is actually the maintenance work. So if you want to focus on extrinsic motivation, it should be on maintainers as opposed to contributors. So I'm just curious what you think about that sentiment and what the Radicle team thinks about that sentiment, and if you've incorporated that type of thinking at all into the designs and experiments you've run.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think yeah, it's a fantastic point that like often there's a lot of motivation to initially create something for a whole variety of reasons, but then it's the maintenance that is both the most difficult, but also the most necessary if you think about these things becoming like infrastructural components. So yeah, this is something we've thought a lot about. I think I would say though that we are somewhat we're trying to stay essentially somewhat agnostic to how people want to use these tools, and so far we're sort of trying to run it more as a series of MVPs and see what folks are interested in. But yeah, I mean, based on I guess just the need for maintainers more, I think more of the funding will gravitate towards that as people look and say, oh my gosh, this project that's very important. I mean, you can actually see this in some of the risk tooling in like NPM, right, where you run your, I forget what the exact flag is, but you run like your NPM like security scan, and it's like you have 20 high security or high risk security vulnerabilities like in your dependency tree below you. I think that can be a real good kind of mechanism to like connect funding to, because a lot of projects building on those projects would be like very motivated to like, all right, I'm willing to split $10 a month or $100 a month down to that to support those. So I think there are mechanisms like that we definitely are interested in and that I think would motivate supporters. Thanks. Do we have more time or are we okay? Well, yeah, like I said, please, we'd love to continue the conversation after this, so please come find me and the rest of the team. Thank you so much.